Hello, and welcome to my tutorial about price controls. These occur when governments decide to fix or set the price of a given good because they believe that either the equilibrium price of that good is too high for consumers or too low for the sellers. To address it, governments may choose to impose a price ceiling or a price floor respectively. A price ceiling is a legal maximum on the price at which a good can be sold. An example of a price ceiling is rent controls, and these are maximum amount that landlords can charge for rent so as to guarantee affordable housing. For all intents and purposes, the controlled rent acts as a ceiling on the value that the rent may take. Another way the government interferes with the price mechanism is by imposing price floors, for example, the minimum wage. Comedian Chris Rock once said, "I used to work at McDonald's making minimum wage. You know what that means when somebody pays you minimum wage? You know what your boss was trying to say? Hey, if I could pay you less, I would. But it's against the law." So for all intents and purposes, a price floor is a bottom line value under which a given price cannot go under. Let's see how these price controls look like graphically. We begin by looking at a price ceiling. This is the maximum price that consumers should pay. To be binding, it is set below equilibrium price. What does this mean to be binding? Something binding is something that involves a compelling effect. Let's suppose for a minute that the price ceiling was set above equilibrium price at PC interrogation mark. If this were the legal maximum imposed by the government, it would be a silly one because it's above equilibrium. It has no effect whatsoever. For it to actually have an impact, for it to be binding, it must give consumers the opportunity to buy the good at a price that is lower than what they would be paying anyway. So clearly, a price ceiling must be set under the equilibrium price. We see that at this lower price, quantity demanded rises and quantity supplied falls, so the market is now facing a shortage. When the market imposes a price floor, it's imposing a legal minimum price sellers should receive. To be binding, it is set above equilibrium price. Why? Let's do the same exercise as before and think of the alternative, and that is to set the price floor below equilibrium price at PF interrogation mark. If this were the legal minimum imposed by the government, it would be a silly one because equilibrium price would be above it anyway. For it to have an impact, it must give sellers the opportunity to receive more than they would in a competitive equilibrium. So clearly a price floor must be set above equilibrium price. We see that at this higher price, quantity demanded falls and quantity supplied rises, so the market is now facing a surplus. As it turns out, these shortage and surplus effects that we observe differ depending on the time frame we are considering. Specifically, these effects are much greater in the long run than in the short run, and the reason is related to a concept called elasticity. An elasticity is a measurement of how much one variable responds to changes in another variable, all else constant. We speak of the price elasticity of demand and or of supply when we talk about how the quantity demanded or supplied of a good changes when the price of that good changes, ceteris paribus. When quantity changes by a greater percentage than price, we say demand or supply are elastic. When quantity changes by a smaller percentage than price, we say demand or supply are inelastic. Over time, both become more elastic. That is, both quantity demanded or supplied react a lot more to a given change in price. And that makes sense. Over time, consumers can find alternatives or substitutes, and sellers can more easily increase capacity. So it's only logical that a given price change will generate greater quantity responses in the long run. We can see this just by looking at the inclination of the demand and supply curves in the different time horizons. As you can see, they're much flatter over the long run, and that simply means that the same price change will generate a greater change in both quantity demanded and supplied than in the short run. Let's see an example using a price ceiling. As you can see, demand rises and supply falls, but in the long run, demand rises more and supply falls more. So the shortage is much greater in the long run than in the short run. Similarly, if we were to look at an example using a price floor, we'd see that in the long run, demand falls by more and supply rises by more than in the short run. So the surplus is much greater in the long run than in the short run. Thank you very much for watching.